So good day everyone. Today we will be talking about the social context of second language acquisition. But before that, we will tell you first what are the topics. So first is the microsocial and macrosocial factors. The second one is the input and interaction. The third is the role of feedback in SLA. The fourth is the computer interaction and SLA. Fifth is the zone of proximal development and scaffolding by Vygotsky. And lastly, the accommodation and acculturation model. Next slide, please. So first, we will discuss about the microsocial and macrosocial factors. In microsocial factors, we will tackle about the alto variation, the input and interaction in Vygotsky's social-cultural theory. So, in microsocial factors in alto variation, it explores how contextual dimensions relate to variation in learner language and considering why differing varieties of an alto may be chosen as targets of SLA even without groups who are supposedly learning the same language. In input and interaction, it explains how native speakers modifies their language in accommodating or communicating with alto learners. It is how instructional strategies along alto learners might differ in actual versus virtual communication, and how social and cultural factors might affect the quantity and quality of input, and how cultural knowledge and prior experience are involved in processing and interpreting input. Lastly is Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, where it explains how Vygotsky's cultural theory fused into direction as the basic journey of language itself and explores how learners negotiate meaning and fulfill pragmatic objectives even while linguistic resources are still exceedingly limited. The macro-social factors. So in this topic, we will discuss about the global and national status of ALTO, the boundaries and identities, the institutional forces and constraints, the social categories and circumstances of learning. So these five macrosocial factors is just related of what is this topic all about. So in macrosocial factors, societal, cultural, and historical context in which individuals lives considers several level and ecological context of SLA, which I've mentioned earlier. So this influences on SLA where power and status of learners' native and target language and social boundaries that are relevant to SLA involves might coincide with national borders, but the ALTO exists within and across the function to unify speakers of a language community within nations. So it is institutional forces and constraints often evicted the use and knowledge of ALTO in relation to such things such as social, cultural, political, and religious practices, and economic and educational opportunities, where there's age, gender, and ethnicity. So there are features of social group membership which may be potentially be relevant to SLA. Now, to sum up, the microsocial focus deals with the potential effects of different immediately surrounding circumstances, while the macrosocial focus relates SLA to broader cultural, political, and educational environments. Now, we will be dealing about the input and interaction. So, in this topic, we will discuss about whatever sample of L2 learners are exposed to, the instruction, which is explicit teaching and often used in school settings, the behaviorist theory, psychological perspective, and social aspect. So in input and interaction, it is how people learn a new language through input or exposure to the language, and interaction or communication with others. So here's a breakdown. In input, it is essential whether learning a first language or L1 or second language or L2. Exposure to a language input is crucial because there are different theories which emphasizes the role of the input in different ways. The first is the behaviorist theories, where it suggests that input acts as a stimuli for learners to respond to and imitate. Krashen's monitor model suggests that comprehensible input or input that learners can understand is not only necessary but also sufficient for language learning. Universal grammar or the UG theory considers input as a trigger for internal mechanisms, but of minimal importance for many aspects of language development beyond the initial state. The second one is the psychological perspectives. So some frameworks like those based on input processing or IP highlights the importance of learners paying attention to input or intake at all stages of language processing. Connectionist framework suggests that the quantity and frequency of input structures largely determine the order in which learners acquire language, though this is not always consistent with actual frequencies. The social aspects or the social approaches to language learning also considers input as a crucial for learners. So they argue that interaction plays a key role in providing learners with the right amount and quality of language input needed for internal processing. So this interaction also helps focuses learners' attention on aspects of the language that differ from their native language and provides collaborative opportunities for learners to express meanings beyond their current linguistic competence. Now, how do people change the way they speak when talking to someone or learning their L2? So when foreigner talks, when native speakers talk to L2 learners, they often use what's called foreigner talk. So this type of speech has certain characteristics. So simple words and phrases that are used often, longer pauses between words, speaking more slowly, pronouncing words more carefully. So speaking louder, putting stress on important words, using simpler sentence structures and starting with a topic then commenting on it, using more regular sentences structures and using more full words instead of contractions or pronouns. For example, the text gives example of how a teacher might modify their speech when talking to Alto children, such as using shorter sentences and simple vocabulary. So the effectiveness of this, while there's no direct proof that these modifications always help learners understand better, there are reports that experienced teachers who make these adjustments are often rated as more understandable by Alto learners. So these modifications are often unconscious but become more deliberate when teaching mixed groups of learners with different proficiency levels. In such cases, the teacher might repeat the important points using simpler language to ensure everyone understands or every student of her classroom understands. Now in academic texts, or how academic texts are modified to make them easier for people learning a second language or their L2 to understand, here are the main points. The organization markers. Academic texts often include clear headings and other markers that help organize the contents. Clear statements, so they also include clear statements about the main topic being discussed. The key terms or the important terms are highlighted and may include synonyms or explanations. Next is the list, which main points are often presented in lists for clarity. Next is the elaboration, where sections that requires background knowledge specific to a culture are explained in more detail. Of course, we also have the visual aids, which illustrations and graphs are used to help explain concepts visually. Summaries. The text includes summaries at regular intervals to recap important points. Of course, questions, where some texts include questions to check comprehension of the students. So these modifications in academic texts for L2 learners are similar to the way adults speak to young children, so in many languages, known as the baby talk. So some modifications like using common phrases and speaking more slowly can help learners understand better. So however, speaking louder or oversimplifying sentences may not be helpful. So in written text for L2 learners also use controlled vocabulary and simpler sentence structures. So these modifications are similar to those used in textbooks for native English speakers. However, simplifying sentence structures alone may not always improve comprehension, providing relevant background knowledge and helping readers focus on important terms and concepts are more effective ways to enhance understanding. Now, how does social interaction helps people learn a language, either both their first language as children and a second language as adults? Now, here's the breakdown. In L1 acquisition, children can learn their first language just by listening to recordings or watching TV. They need to socialize or socialize with others or interact with them. In L2 acquisition, while many L2 learners do learn without face-to-face interaction, interacting with native speakers can greatly improve proficiency. For example, some Chinese learners became very proficient in English despite not interacting in English until later in life. For interactional modifications, when native speakers talk to L2 learners, they often make changes to help them understand better. Some of these modifications include the repetition, repeating what was said before to give learners more time to process and confirm their understanding. Next is paraphrasing, so explaining the same idea in different words to help learners understand better. Third is expansion, providing more information to help learners understand the context better. Next is the sentence completion, giving part of a sentence for learners to finish and helping them practice using the language. Comprehension checks also is to ask questions to make sure learners understand. The topic selection, which chooses topics familiar to the learners to aid understanding. And lastly, the topic switching, where they change topics if there's a misunderstanding to clarify communication. I think that's it for my part. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Na. So now I am going to discuss the rule of feedback in SLA and computer interaction and in SLA. So the first one, role of feedback in SLA. So in second language acquisition, feedback plays a crucial role in improving the language skills of non-native speakers. So feedback can either be positive or negative and can be provided in various forms. So while positive feedback reinforces the correct usage and boosts the confidence of non-native speakers, while the negative feedback is essential for pointing out errors and enhancing accuracy. So negative feedback can be provided in direct or indirect form. In direct feedback, the instructor or native speaker explicitly tells the non-native speaker that their usage is incorrect. So this feedback can be in form of explicit statement like that is the wrong word, or directives about what cannot or must be said. For example, sa direct feedback, the instructor will say, you should use the present perfect tense instead of the past simple tense here. Another example is the instructor will say, when talking about your family members, we should use sister for a female sibling. So in terms po sa indirect feedback, the native speaker does not provide explicit correction but uses various techniques to signal to non-native speaker that their usage was incorrect. For example, sa indirect feedback, in terms of comprehension check, so the instructor will say, if I understand correctly, you went to store yesterday, is that right? So the instructor is checking comprehension while indirectly correcting the use of verb tense. So in terms of the paraphrasing, the instructor will say, you said he don't like ice cream, right? So you mean he does not like ice cream? So the instructor paraphrases the sentence while correcting the use of verb tense and subject verb agreement. So another example is instructor will say, I have a pen, you have a pen, he has a pen. So the instructor repeats the correct form while indirectly correcting the error in subject verb agreement. So this technique can be used by native speakers to help non-native speakers understand their errors to provide corrective feedback without making them feel embarrassed or rejected. So research shown that feedback, whether positive or negative, is critical for non-native speakers to reach their desired level of proficiency and fluency in the target language. Feedback is fundamental component of language learning, and both positive and negative feedback play an important role in second language acquisition. So non-native speakers benefit from both forms of feedback. Instructors and non-native speakers should use a variety of techniques to provide feedback that is clear, effective, and culturally sensitive. Next is we go sa computer interaction and SLA. So ang computer interaction has a prominent feature in the field of second language acquisition, allowing learners to engage in Alto speakers or other learners virtually. So while it may not provide the same face-to-face interaction, computer-mediated experiences can provide similarities and differences in corrective feedback to learners, especially in synchronous oral interaction, such, such as Zoom. So there are similarities occurrences of corrections, repair, comprehension checks, and requests for clarification. This interaction occurs in similar forms, whether the interaction is with a native speaker of a L2 or another L2 learner. When the CMC involves in written interaction, an additional type of feedback is negotiation of form. So learners pay more attention to self correction, so which helps them think more critically about the language they use. So participating in virtual community could provide a better early L2 learning environment for some students than face-to-face interaction. For example, students who sign on for computer mediated communication or CMC can be anonymous. They can use pseudonym and present a face on their own choice and creation, so which can cancel social mandates imposed on certain students. Anonymity may also engage all to production and interaction by students who are not naturally risk takers and remove other social inequalities that may discourage interactive participation. So according sa claims made in the interaction hypothesis, modifications and collaborative efforts takes place in the social interaction facility to SLA. So because they contribute to the accessibility of input for mental processing. So this includes negotiation for meaning, which triggers interaction adjustment by native speakers or more competent. It facilitates acquisition by connecting inputs, internal learners' capacities, particularly selecting attention and output in production ways. So to sum up, computer interaction has become an important tool in second language acquisition. Through through this, sa kaning CMC, learners can engage with L2 speakers or other learners and receive similar forms of corrective feedback, whether sa written or oral interaction. Moreover, participating in virtual communities would help cancel social mandates exposed on certain students, which can encourage more L2 production and interaction. Finally, through the interaction hypothesis, learners can benefit from the modification and collaborative efforts that occur in social interaction for mental processing.
Thank you, Miss Muniz. So I'm gonna tackle about the zone of proximal development and scaffolding by Lev Vygotsky and the accommodation and acculturation model. So next slide, please. So Lev Vygotsky was a social psychologist na who introduced us the concept of zone of proximal development or ZPD. Um, and not also that, and also it's as scaffolding also. So he believes that children learn in best within the support in communities and in his surroundings, adults them. So the ZPD refers to the range of tasks that a children can perform with the help of others. But cannot yet do independently. So it can be scaffolding is refers to a technique used to support the learners. And in their language development within the ZPD, it involves providing learners with chunk of talks or verbal guidance to help them to express their concepts so that they're beyond their current abilities. So scaffolding can be provided by experts or peers and it's not passive but process but an active also collaborating. So between the learners and the supporter. For for, ex- for example, scaffolding. Scaffolding can be seen in dialogue or between peers preparing a presentation for each other or members of the group, and some knowledge, but none of them are individually know how to produce the correct um, equivalent or French that you remember or through collaboration of building upon each other, but knowledge, they eventually arrive at the desired solution. So, next slide, please. So, in language learning, both the first language L1 and the L2 or second language can provide helpful mediation. So, in person collaborating in tasks is often used their common L1 to efficiently solve the problem. So, and enhance their learning in L2 in academic subjects studied in the second language. So, in symbolic mediation, they can also occur in non-linguistic symbolic or such gestures or diagrams or illustration and algebraic symbols. So it is important to note that Lev Vygotsky works was not available outside of Russia until after his death. Due to politician reasons, his work were banned in the Soviet Union from 1936 to 1956. So it is because of his criticism of official approved theories of psychological at that time. So now in accommodation and acculturation model, it as a framework used to study the effect of microsocial and macrosocial context on language acquisition. In the microsocial context, speakers unconsciously adjust their pronunciation and sentence complexity to sound more like a person they are talking to. So this means why native speakers is simplify their language when speaking to a non-fluent second language learners. So additionally, the second language learners may acquire different language so depending on their social circles. So in the macro-social context, learners may acquire different varieties of the same target language based on factors such as gender or occupation. For example, that like female immigrants in the US may use more in standard variant of language in compared to the male immigrant due to differences in their employment opportunities like as a workplace stratification or they are influenced by the language input and a group of identity. So in acculturation is the process of crossing linguistic boundaries. So to practice their another language or community or what they adopt its culture and their values and their behaviors also patterns. So for full participation in a community requires learners the language and adapting. So its cultural norms or the extent of curation. Maybe it depends on group motivation. So motivation plays a significant role in language also learning and influenced by external social factors. So social psychologists study the second language acquisition. They emphasize the effect or motivation of the cultural and linguistic integration. So in immigrant or ethnic minority or group into the dominant to the society. So motivation also explains why dominant group members may not learn minority language if they are well they do not want to be associated with any community. Here, the acculturation model proposed by John Schumpman identifies the group factors that negatively affect the second language acquisition outcomes. So the factors such as group dominance or segregation